Security guard answered a call in German behind a millionaire. What he did next shocked everyone. The air in the hallway turned brittle as Marcus Bell froze mid-step outside Richard Harlow's study. Through the slightly open door, he watched the billionaire's shoulders tense, his voice dropping to a whisper. Then came the words, sharp, precise, and definitely not English. Ich verstehe. Ja, Morgan. German. The language flowed from Harlow's lips with the ease of someone who'd spoken it for years. Yet in 3 years of guarding the man, Marcus had never heard him utter a single German word. Not once. Not ever. The billionaire's knuckles whitened around the phone as he hung up. He moved to the window, his reflection in the glass revealing what few ever saw. Raw fear in the eyes of one of America's most powerful men. Some secrets aren't just kept, they're buried. The wealthiest among us don't just hide their money, they hide their truths. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the carefully constructed personas of those who seem to have everything? What would drive a man worth billions to speak in hushed tones in a language he pretends not to know? In that moment, Marcus faced a choice that would change both their lives forever. Step away and forget what he heard, or step forward and uncover what Harlow had been hiding for decades. What happens when the man hired to guard against outside threats becomes witness to the danger lurking within? What truth could be so devastating that one of the richest men in America would build an empire just to outrun it? The answer would shake the foundations of history itself. Richard Harlow stood at the pinnacle of American wealth, a man whose name graced financial magazines and whose opinion could shift markets with a single word. From his Los Angeles mansion overlooking the city he once conquered, he ruled an empire worth $18 billion, built from a single investment 30 years ago. The world knew his success story, the orphan boy who rose from poverty through sheer determination. What the world didn't know were the shadows that followed him, the moments he stared out at the skyline with eyes haunted by something money couldn't erase. The most dangerous secrets, Harlow often told his closest advisors, are the ones we keep from ourselves. Few understood the weight behind those words. Fewer still questioned why a man with everything seemed perpetually searching for something more. The marble floors of Harlow's estate echoed with his footsteps as he paced his study each night, reviewing documents few were permitted to see. His collection of rare first editions lined walls of mahogany bookshelves. Crystal decanters of aged whiskey caught the light from the fireplace, where flames danced against priceless art. This was the fortress he'd built, not just of wealth, but of carefully constructed silence. If you're fascinated by what the ultra-wealthy hide beneath their polished exteriors, hit that like button and subscribe now. These aren't just stories of money and power. They're revelations about how the past shapes even those who seem untouchable. Marcus Bell wasn't impressed by luxury. 8 years in the Marine Corps had taught him to see what others missed. The slight twitch of a finger, the imperceptible shift in breathing, the eyes that darted too quickly when certain questions arose. As Harlow's head of security for 3 years, Marcus had developed an understanding of the billionaire that went beyond professional observation. He noticed how Harlow avoided certain dates on the calendar, how he would sometimes pause before family photographs, his expression unreadable, how he kept a locked cabinet in his study that no one, not even his closest associates, was permitted to open. Marcus understood discretion. His career protecting high-profile clients had been built on it. 6'2" with shoulders squared by military discipline, he moved through Harlow's world with quiet precision. His presence was commanding, yet nearly invisible, exactly as intended. His job wasn't just to guard against physical threats, but to anticipate them, to read rooms and people before danger materialized. Security isn't about strength, he'd learned in the Corps. It's about seeing what no one else sees. What he couldn't have anticipated was how that skill would pull him into the orbit of a secret buried so deep that its revelation would challenge everything he thought he knew about the man he protected, and about history itself. The relationship between the two men was professional, distant. Harlow valued Marcus's discretion. Marcus respected Harlow's privacy. Neither expected that a single phone call would shatter that careful distance and thrust them both into a past that had been buried for generations, a past that would now demand its reckoning. The Tuesday evening routine never varied. Harlow worked in his study until 9 p.m., reviewed security reports, then retired to the East Wing. Marcus stationed himself outside the study door, alert yet unobtrusive. It was a rhythm 3 years in the making, as consistent as the atomic clock Harlow kept on his desk. Until tonight. Marcus had just completed his routine check of the perimeter when he heard it. Harlow's voice, but different. Lower, more urgent. He approached the study door, his footsteps silent against the thick carpet, a skill honed through countless combat missions. The door stood slightly ajar, unusual for a man obsessed with privacy. Through the narrow gap, Marcus saw Harlow standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear, shoulders rigid with tension. The billionaire's reflection in the glass revealed what few ever saw, vulnerability on the face of one of America's most powerful men. Nein, das ist unmöglich. Harlow's German flowed with native fluency. Kann nicht noch am Leben sein. Marcus froze. In his extensive security briefing upon taking the job, Harlow's file listed English as his only language. The German wasn't just surprising, it was deliberate omission from the record. Ich komme morgen. Bereite alles vor. Harlow's voice hardened. Niemand darf davon erfahren. Nobody must know about this. The words hit Marcus with unexpected force. His mind raced through every interaction, every conversation with Harlow over the past 3 years, searching for clues he might have missed. Had there been signs? Moments when the billionaire had slipped, revealed something of this hidden self? Harlow ended the call abruptly, his hand trembling as he set down the phone. For nearly a minute, he remained motionless, staring out at the city below. Then, with deliberate movements, he crossed to the antique desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. The one Marcus had never seen open. The ex-Marine stepped back from the door, conflicting instincts warring within him. His training demanded he maintain his post, respect the confidentiality of his employer. But something deeper, the instinct that had kept him alive through 3 tours overseas, whispered that what he'd witnessed wasn't merely unusual, it was a warning. Inside the study, Harlow removed a worn leather journal from the drawer, his movements uncharacteristically urgent. Pages filled with faded German script spread across the desk as he searched for something specific, his breathing shallow and quick. Marcus moved away from the door as Harlow began pacing, muttering to himself in German. The billionaire's composure, the iron control that had defined him in boardrooms and crisis meetings, had fractured. In its place was something Marcus recognized from his military days, the look of a man confronting a threat he'd hoped would never materialize. 20 minutes passed. Marcus maintained his position, mind cycling through scenarios, none of them reassuring. When the study door finally opened, Harlow emerged looking a decade older, his face drawn, his movements stiff. "Sir?" Marcus acknowledged with a professional nod. "Everything all right?" Harlow's eyes met his, searching, as if measuring what Marcus might have heard. "Fine, Bell. Just unexpected business." The lie hung between them, so obvious that acknowledging it would force a confrontation neither was prepared for. "I'll need to travel tomorrow," Harlow continued, his voice steady but strained. "International. Arrange the jet for 6 a.m. No flight plan filed until absolutely necessary." "Destination, sir." Harlow hesitated, the fraction of a second speaking volumes. "Munich. Private landing arrangements. Minimum security detail. Just you." Munich. Germany. The connection clicked into place. "Duration of stay?" "Uncertain." Harlow's fingers tapped an agitated rhythm against his leg, another anomaly from a man whose stillness was legendary. "Pack for 3 days, bring your passport. Discretion is paramount." Marcus nodded, professional mask firmly in place despite the questions thundering through his mind. "Understood, sir." As Harlow turned to leave, he paused. "Bell," he began, then stopped himself, reconsidering. "Nothing. Have everything ready by 5 a.m. The billionaire disappeared down the hallway, leaving Marcus alone with knowledge he never sought and now couldn't ignore. Back in his quarters, Marcus stared at the ceiling, sleep impossible. His security training battled his moral compass. His duty was clear: protect Harlow, follow orders, maintain discretion. But the German conversation, the hidden journal, the urgent trip to Munich, all pointed to something beyond the scope of his contract. He pulled out his laptop, hesitating before typing Richard Harlow background into the search bar. Thousands of results appeared. Articles about his business empire, philanthropic efforts, rare interviews where he deflected personal questions with practiced ease. Nothing about German connections, nothing about a past before his first investment 30 years ago. It was the absence that troubled Marcus most. For a man as prominent as Harlow, the lack of personal history wasn't just unusual, it was deliberate. He closed the laptop, decision made. Tomorrow he would accompany Harlow to Munich, not just as security, but as witness. Whatever secret had remained buried for decades was surfacing now, and Marcus recognized the gravity of what lay ahead. Some truths changed everything, not just history, but the people who carried it. The question wasn't whether he should get involved. He already was. The question was whether the truth would destroy the man he'd sworn to protect, or reveal someone entirely different beneath the carefully constructed facade of Richard Harlow, billionaire. Morning came too quickly, gray light filtering through the blinds as Marcus packed with military efficiency. Whatever waited in Munich, he would face it with the same discipline that had guided him through war zones. He checked his watch. 4:30 a.m. Time to discover what made one of the world's most powerful men speak German in the shadows of his own home. The hidden past revealed the private jet hummed at 35,000 feet, its luxurious interior a stark contrast to the tension filling the cabin. For 3 hours, Harlow had remained silent, reviewing documents from a worn leather case, avoiding eye contact. Marcus maintained his professional distance, seated where he could observe both Harlow and the cabin entrance. The silence broke unexpectedly when Harlow closed his folder and looked directly at Marcus. "You heard me on the phone last night." Not a question, a statement delivered with quiet certainty. Marcus considered denying it, but recognized the moment for what it was. "Yes, sir." "German. You recognized it?" "I did." Harlow nodded slowly as if confirming something to himself. He reached for his briefcase and withdrew a faded photograph, its edges worn from handling. For several moments he studied it, then extended it toward Marcus. "This is my grandfather, Heinrich Harlow, though that wasn't always his name." Marcus accepted the photograph. It showed a young man in his 20s, standing beside an older couple. The date stamp read 1946. Nothing immediately notable except the hollow look in the young man's eyes, a look Marcus had seen in veterans returning from combat zones. "Your grandfather emigrated after the war." Marcus kept his tone neutral, professional. "Escaped is more accurate." Harlow's fingers tapped against the armrest. "My grandfather was German. He came to America in 1945 with a new identity, a new past, and secrets he believed would die with him." The revelation hung in the pressurized cabin. Marcus waited, knowing better than to interrupt. "For most of my life, I knew nothing about his past," Harlow continued. "He was simply Grandpa Henry, kind, disciplined, haunted by nightmares he refused to discuss. When he died, I was 23. The only thing he left specifically for me was a locked box with strict instructions that I alone should open it." Harlow's gaze drifted to the clouds outside. Inside were documents, photographs, and letters, all in German. "It took me months to translate everything. When I did," he paused, the weight of memory visible in his expression. "My grandfather had been stationed at Dachau during the war. He wasn't a camp guard or officer. He was an accountant, tracking supplies, managing logistics. His records showed a man doing his job, nothing more. But there were inconsistencies, small notes, coded messages, references to people whose names appeared nowhere in official documents." Marcus felt the implications settling like a physical weight. He was involved with the Nazi regime. By position, yes. By choice? Harlow shook his head. "That's what I've spent 30 years trying to understand. The man who raised me taught kindness, emphasized the value of human dignity. Could that same man have been complicit in one of history's greatest atrocities?" The question needed no answer. Both men understood the complexity of human nature, how people contain multitudes, contradictions buried beneath the surface. Harlow took back the photograph, handling it with reverence. "For decades, I've carried this knowledge alone, building my company, my reputation, my life, all while wondering if I was worthy of success, if his actions somehow tainted my existence. "And the call last night?" Marcus asked. Harlow's expression darkened. "Wolfgang Reinhardt, a name that appeared throughout my grandfather's papers. He was my grandfather's commanding officer at Dachau, a high-ranking official who disappeared after the war. The world presumed him dead. But he's not. No." Harlow's voice hardened. "He's 98 years old, living outside Munich. He contacted my private line, a number known to fewer than 10 people worldwide. He claims to have information about my grandfather, claims to know the truth that will change everything I believe about him." Marcus absorbed this, the tactical part of his mind already calculating security risks, possible traps. "How did he get your number?" "That's one of many questions I intend to ask when we meet him." "When we meet him?" Marcus repeated. "Sir, with respect, this could be dangerous in ways beyond physical threats. If his connection to your grandfather becomes public, my reputation, my company, everything I've built could collapse." Harlow finished the thought with surprising calm. "I'm aware, but living with uncertainty has become its own prison. I need to know who my grandfather truly was and what that means for who I am." The confession carried a vulnerability Marcus had never witnessed in the billionaire. For 3 years, he'd protected a man he thought incapable of such emotional exposure. "The German you spoke, you learned it to read his documents?" "I learned it because it was his native tongue, his first connection to the world. I wanted to understand him through the language that shaped his thoughts." Harlow's expression softened momentarily. "He spoke to me in German sometimes when I was very young, before he realized it might raise questions." The jet began its descent toward Munich, the Alps rising majestically through the clouds. Harlow gathered his documents, his movements deliberate, controlled. "Bell, what I've shared goes beyond your security contract. Once we land, you can request reassignment without consequence. Your discretion regarding what you've learned would be appreciated but not demanded." Marcus considered the offer, understanding its significance. Harlow was releasing him from obligation, giving him an exit before they stepped further into unknown territory. "With respect, sir, I'll stay." The decision felt inevitable, as if preordained. Some journeys shouldn't be faced alone. Harlow studied him, perhaps seeing Marcus truly for the first time, not just as security, but as a man whose own experiences had taught him about the weight of truth and the value of bearing witness. "Thank you." 2 simple words carrying unexpected weight. As the jet touched down on German soil, both men understood they were crossing a threshold. Whatever awaited them would forever alter the narrative of Harlow's life, and perhaps history itself. If you've ever discovered a family secret that changed how you view yourself or your loved ones, share your experience in the comments. What would you do if you uncovered a truth about your ancestry that challenged everything you believed about your identity? Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we inherit without knowing. The black Mercedes carved through the Bavarian countryside, morning fog clinging to fields that had witnessed history's darkest chapter. Harlow sat motionless in the back seat, eyes fixed on passing villages whose quaint exteriors masked deeper histories. These rolling hills had birthed both beauty and horror, a contradiction Harlow understood all too well. Marcus drove, hyper-aware of their isolation. No security team, no backup, just 2 men pursuing a truth that had remained buried for generations. "Turn left at the next crossing," Harlow instructed, checking coordinates on his phone. "The address is remote, deliberately so." The road narrowed, winding through dense forest until civilization disappeared behind them. They emerged into a clearing where a modest stone house stood alone, smoke rising from its chimney. The building seemed trapped in another era, solid, unyielding, a relic of a time both wished to forget yet needed to confront. "We're here." Harlow's voice carried the weight of finality. Marcus parked, scanning the perimeter with practiced efficiency. "I should enter first." "No." Harlow's hand stopped him. "Whatever awaits inside, I need to face it directly." They approached the house together, gravel crunching beneath their feet, the only sound in the overwhelming quiet. Before they reached the door, it opened. Wolfgang Reinhardt stood before them, time etched into every line of his face. At 98, his body had withered, but his eyes remained sharp, alert, windows to a mind that had carried secrets across decades. He leaned heavily on a wooden cane, his thin frame draped in a cardigan despite the summer warmth. Herr Harlow, his voice cracked with age yet carried unexpected strength. You have your grandfather's eyes. The observation landed like a physical blow. Harlow stiffened but maintained his composure. Herr Reinhardt, you said you have information about my grandfather. Information? The old man's laugh held no humor. I have the truth. Come in, please. The interior of the house reflected its occupant, austere, functional, with few concessions to comfort. Books lined every wall, their spines cracked from repeated reading, historical volumes, philosophy texts, memoirs, the collection of a man devoted to understanding rather than forgetting. Reinhardt gestured toward a modest sitting area. Tea? Or perhaps something stronger? Nothing, thank you, Harlow replied, remaining standing. I came for answers, not hospitality. The old man nodded, lowering himself carefully into an armchair, worn thin by years of use. Direct, like Heinrich. He sighed deeply. You wish to know who your grandfather was during the war, what he did, whether the man who raised you was worthy of your love. I want the truth, whatever it may be. Reinhardt studied Harlow, then shifted his gaze to Marcus. And your companion? Is he here to protect you from harm, or from what you might learn? Both, perhaps, Marcus answered before Harlow could respond. Truth has its own dangers. This earned a nod of appreciation from the old man. Wisdom in one so young. He turned back to Harlow. I was your grandfather's commanding officer at Dachau. I was 22, ambitious, a true believer in the Reich's ideology. Heinrich was 20, assigned to administrative duties, tracking supplies, maintaining records. Reinhardt reached for a leather folder beside his chair, opening it to reveal yellowed documents, their edges crumbling with age. Official records show your grandfather as exemplary, efficient, loyal, unquestioning. He met Harlow's gaze. Official records lie. Harlow's jaw tightened. Explain. Your grandfather was assigned to my unit in 1943. By then, the camp's purpose was clear to anyone working within their walls. There was no pretending, no ignorance possible. Reinhardt's hands trembled slightly as he sorted through papers. Heinrich processed inventory reports. Clothing taken from prisoners, valuables confiscated, supplies needed for daily operations. Marcus watched Harlow's expression harden with each word, preparing himself for the worst. 3 months after his arrival, discrepancies began appearing in the records. Reinhardt extracted a document, its columns filled with neat German handwriting. Food supplies that arrived but were never officially distributed. Medication that disappeared between delivery and inventory. Clothing marked as destroyed that never reached the incinerators. Harlow accepted the document, studying the faded numbers. He was stealing supplies. He was keeping people alive. Reinhardt's voice dropped, heavy with memory. Small acts, carefully hidden. Extra rations to the children's barracks. Medicine to the infirmary. Winter clothing to those assigned to outside labor. The revelation hung in the air between them. Not the confession of atrocity Harlow had braced for, but something more complex. Evidence of quiet rebellion within a system designed to crush all resistance. If you knew, why didn't you report him? Marcus asked, the tactical part of his mind unable to reconcile the risk versus the small gains. Reinhardt's gaze drifted to the window, to the forest beyond, as if the trees held memories he could still see. Because by then, I had begun to question everything I believed. The war was turning against Germany. Reports from the Eastern Front described catastrophic losses. And within the camp, he shook his head. What we were doing could not be justified, even to myself. Harlow remained silent, processing this first revelation. His grandfather as silent rebel rather than willing participant. But that is not why I contacted you. Reinhardt reached deeper into the folder, withdrawing a photograph that he hesitated to share. This is why. The photo showed a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, emaciated but alive, standing beside a younger Reinhardt. The child's eyes held a haunted wisdom no child should possess. This boy was caught stealing bread in November 1944. Camp protocol demanded immediate execution for such offenses. Examples made to maintain order. I was ordered to oversee his punishment personally. Reinhardt's voice wavered. Your grandfather intervened. Harlow's breathing changed, becoming shallow, controlled. How? He falsified transfer documents, created a fictional work assignment, convinced another guard the boy had special skills needed elsewhere. Reinhardt's aged fingers traced the child's face in the photograph. 3 separate acts, each punishable by death if discovered. He risked everything for a child whose name he didn't even know. Marcus felt the atmosphere shift, tension giving way to something else. Disbelief, perhaps, or the vertigo of having fundamental truths suddenly inverted. The boy in this photo, Reinhardt continued, his voice barely audible. This is me. Silence consumed the room. Harlow stared at the photograph, then at the man before him, searching for the connection across decades, across the chasm between the skeletal child and the elderly man now sitting before him. That's impossible, Harlow finally managed. The impossible happens every day, Reinhardt replied. Your grandfather saved my life, Herr Harlow. When the Reich collapsed, when Allied forces approached, he arranged my escape, gave me new identity papers, told me to run and never look back. Harlow sank into a chair, the weight of revelation too heavy to bear standing. Why would he take such risks? For you? For supplies? For strangers? Reinhardt considered the question with the gravity it deserved. He told me once, in a rare moment of candor, that he could not change the world, could not stop the machinery of death. But he could create moments of humanity within it, small acts that kept his soul intact when everything around him conspired to destroy it. The profound simplicity of this philosophy struck both Harlow and Marcus. Not grand heroism, not dramatic resistance, but the quiet insistence that even within horror, one could choose decency. After the war, Reinhardt continued, we maintained contact through coded messages, mutual acquaintances. He worried that his past would follow him to America, that it would someday reach you. His eyes, roomy with age yet sharp with memory, locked onto Harlow's. He feared you would learn only part of the truth, that he had worn the uniform, worked within the system, been part of the machine. He never wanted you to carry that burden. Harlow's voice, when he finally found it, emerged raw with emotion. Why tell me now, after all these years? Reinhardt reached for another document, this one official-looking with government seals. Because last month, German authorities opened a new investigation into Dachau personnel. They found records with your grandfather's name, his position, without context, without the full truth. His legacy and yours would be defined by association alone. The implications crystallized instantly. Headlines, investigations, generations of Harlow's work undone by historical association. I am dying, Herr Harlow. Cancer. The doctors give me weeks, perhaps days. I could not take this knowledge to my grave, could not let Heinrich's true legacy die with me. Reinhardt offered the final document, a handwritten letter. Your grandfather wrote this before his death, asked me to keep it until absolutely necessary. The time has come. Harlow accepted the letter with trembling hands, recognizing the handwriting immediately. The precise script that had signed birthday cards, written notes of encouragement, penned wisdom in the margins of books gifted over years. As he unfolded the pages, Marcus watched the final transformation. The billionaire stripped bare of pretense, reduced to simply a grandson confronting the complex truth of inheritance, both biological and moral. The letter began, My dearest Richard, if you are reading this, you now know the truth I could never bring myself to tell you. Harlow's hands trembled as he unfolded his grandfather's letter, the paper thin with age, the ink faded but legible. The room fell silent save for the ticking of an ancient clock on the mantel. My dearest Richard, he read aloud, his voice catching. If you are reading this, you now know the truth I could never bring myself to tell you. Not from shame, but from fear. Fear that you would carry the weight I have carried, that you would inherit not just my name, but my burden. Marcus remained motionless by the window, watching Harlow's face as decades of uncertainty transformed into painful clarity. I was not a hero, Richard. Heroes announce themselves, stand boldly against evil. I simply did what I could within a system too powerful to openly defy. Small acts of rebellion that seemed insignificant against the machinery of death surrounding us. Falsified records, extra rations, medicines diverted, lives extended rather than saved, until Wolfgang. Harlow paused, glancing up at Reinhardt, who sat with eyes closed, as if reliving the memory. The boy was caught stealing bread for other children in his barracks. I witnessed his capture, saw the guards drag him to the yard. Protocol demanded immediate execution as an example. I knew I could not save them all. This terrible knowledge haunted every moment of my existence there. But this child, this one child perhaps. Reinhardt opened his eyes, tears gathering at their corners. He created 3 separate documents in one night. Falsified transfer orders, invented a work assignment requiring small hands for machinery maintenance, convinced a guard I had valuable skills. 3 acts that would have meant death for us both if discovered. Harlow continued reading. I moved him between work details for weeks, keeping him away from those who had ordered his execution. When it became clear the Reich was collapsing, I created new identity papers, placed him with refugees heading west, and prayed he would survive. I never expected to see him again. I never expected him to find me. Marcus watched the billionaire's expression shift, decades of uncertainty giving way to understanding. The truth was more complex than the binary judgment Harlow had feared. Neither absolute guilt nor spotless innocence, but the complicated reality of a man making choices inside an inhuman system. After the war, Harlow read, I came to America, changed my name, tried to build a life free from the shadow of what I had witnessed. I married your grandmother, raised your father, and eventually welcomed you. My greatest joy. With each year that passed, I convinced myself that silence was protection, that you deserved a grandfather untainted by history's darkest chapter. Reinhardt leaned forward, his voice barely audible. He sent me money every year, anonymous transfers that helped me rebuild my life. I used it to establish a foundation for Holocaust survivors. The money that saved me continued saving others. Harlow looked up sharply. He never told me. He never told anyone, Reinhardt replied. Some acts of decency require no audience. Returning to the letter, Harlow continued. I tell you this now not to absolve myself, but to offer you the truth. I worked within a system of calculated evil. I witnessed atrocities I was powerless to stop. I compromised daily, telling myself small acts of resistance mattered. Perhaps they did not. Perhaps they were merely the desperate attempts of a coward trying to preserve what remained of his humanity. The room fell silent as Harlow turned to the final page, the words blurring through unexpected tears. But know this, my beloved grandson. Whatever you discover about me, whatever judgment history passes, the love I have for you remains pure. If my actions during those dark years merit any redemption, I find it not in grand claims of resistance, but in this. When faced with a single opportunity to save one life, I chose mercy over obedience, humanity over ideology. In that moment, perhaps, I was the man I have tried to be for you. Harlow lowered the letter, his entire world realigning around this new truth. For decades, he had feared his grandfather was a monster, hiding behind a gentle facade. The reality, a flawed man who had made one crucial choice when it mattered most, was both smaller and vastly more profound. After your grandfather escaped to America, Reinhardt said, breaking the silence, the Allies came. They found the records, the evidence of systematic murder. They prosecuted those they could catch. Your grandfather would have faced imprisonment, perhaps execution, regardless of his small acts of resistance. He gestured toward the window, toward the distant mountains. History demands black and white when reality offers endless shades of gray. Marcus observed the transformation happening before him, Harlow's rigid posture softening as if a lifetime of internal tension had suddenly released. The billionaire who had built walls around himself, who had kept everyone at a careful distance, was experiencing what few ever achieve, the collapse of a lifetime's uncertainty. Did you maintain contact with him after the war? Harlow asked. Reinhardt nodded. Coded messages at first, then occasional letters once it seemed safe. He followed my life from a distance, knew when I married, when my children were born. A sad smile crossed his weathered face. He sent gifts, always anonymously, always generous. One good deed extending across decades. Harlow stood abruptly, moving to the window where Marcus stood. The morning light caught his profile, highlighting the features he'd inherited from the grandfather he thought he'd never truly known. "My entire life," he said quietly, "I've been running, building wealth as a shield, creating a legacy so powerful it would overshadow whatever terrible truth might emerge about my bloodline." He turned back to Reinhardt, his expression transformed. "I've spent decades preparing for a revelation that would destroy me. Instead, I find this, a complicated truth about a man who made one critical choice." Marcus understood the revelation's magnitude. Harlow had constructed his entire existence around a fear that now proved unfounded. Not the fear that his grandfather had participated in atrocity, that much was true, but the fear that participation was the sum total of the man. "Your grandfather was neither hero nor villain," Reinhardt said. "He was human in an inhuman time. When systems of power become instruments of cruelty, ordinary decency becomes extraordinary rebellion." Harlow returned to his chair, lifting the photograph of Reinhardt as a boy, skeletal, frightened, yet somehow still alive. "One life," he murmured. "He couldn't save them all, so he saved one. And through that one," Reinhardt replied, "many more. My foundation has supported hundreds of survivors, educated thousands about the Holocaust. Your grandfather's choice created ripples across generations." The weight of this revelation settled over the room. Harlow's hands steadied as he carefully refolded the letter, returning it to its envelope with newfound reverence. "All my life," he said finally, "I've defined myself in opposition to a ghost. A grandfather I feared rather than the one I knew. I built walls instead of bridges. I accumulated power instead of connection." He looked at Marcus, then back to Reinhardt. "I protected myself from a truth that wasn't even true." Marcus recognized the moment for what it was, not just historical reconciliation, but personal transformation. The billionaire who had hired him was disappearing before his eyes, replaced by someone both stronger and more vulnerable. "What will you do now?" Marcus asked. Harlow considered the question, his answer emerging with quiet certainty. "Honor the truth, all of it. My grandfather's complicity and his courage, his silence and his action, the system he served and the humanity he preserved." He met Reinhardt's gaze. "No more running, no more walls." Reinhardt nodded, satisfaction evident in his rheumy eyes. "Then his final wish is fulfilled. He wanted you free from the burden he carried, not through ignorance, but through understanding." As morning light filled the modest room where past and present had collided, the three men sat in silence, each contemplating the thin line between complicity and courage, between what we inherit and what we choose. Has a single moment of truth ever completely changed how you viewed someone in your life? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the people we think we know best hold revelations that can transform our understanding of both them and ourselves. The drive back to Munich passed in weighted silence. Rain began to fall, drops racing across the windows like tears, the landscape blurring into watercolor strokes of green and gray. At Harlow's request, they stopped at a small crossroads where a centuries-old stone church stood sentinel against the gathering storm. "I need air," he said simply, stepping out into the downpour without reaching for an umbrella. Marcus watched through the windshield as the billionaire moved toward the ancient building, rain darkening his expensive suit, plastering his silver hair to his skull. For the first time in 3 years, Harlow looked diminished, not by weakness, but by the crushing weight of revelation. How does one reconcile a lifetime of fear with a truth both better and worse than imagined? The question hung between them, unspoken yet palpable. Marcus joined him beneath the stone archway of the church entrance, respecting his silence. The interior beckoned, a sanctuary from both rain and reality. But Harlow remained fixed at the threshold, caught between shelter and storm. A perfect metaphor, Marcus thought, for the choice now before him. "My entire empire," Harlow finally said, his voice barely audible above the rainfall, "was built on running away. Every dollar, every acquisition, every achievement, all of it constructed to outpace a past I was terrified to confront. He turned to Marcus, rainwater tracking down his face like tears he'd never allowed himself to shed. What does that make me? The question wasn't rhetorical. In the equalizing force of truth, their roles had shifted. No longer billionaire and employee, but simply two men standing before history's weight. Human, Marcus answered. Harlow exhaled sharply, almost a laugh. Is that enough? It's everything. Lightning flashed across the valley, momentarily illuminating the crossroads where four paths extended outward. Toward Munich, toward Reinhardt's cottage, toward the mountains, toward the unknown. Harlow moved from the shelter of the archway, standing exposed at the literal crossroads. Rain soaking him completely. My grandfather lived a divided life, he said, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Part monster, part savior, part coward, part hero. He compromised to survive, then found one moment to reclaim his humanity. He turned back to Marcus. And I've spent my life terrified of being just like him. Aren't we all? Marcus stepped forward, joining him in the rain. Capable of both cruelty and kindness, of weakness and strength. The only difference is the scale of our choices. Harlow considered this, the rain washing away any pretense of control. I've spent 30 years preparing for the world to discover my grandfather was a Nazi, building defenses, accumulating power, creating a legacy so magnificent it could withstand any revelation. His voice strengthened. But I never prepared for this. A truth more complicated than villainous grandfather or heroic resistance fighter. Marcus recognized the transformation happening before him, armor being shed, walls crumbling. The billionaire who'd hired him had been constructed from equal parts ambition and fear. The man standing before him now was something else entirely. Raw, unfinished, yet somehow more complete. What will you do? Marcus asked. Harlow turned fully toward him, something new emerging in his expression. Not certainty, but acceptance. Stop running. My grandfather couldn't escape the system he served, but he found a way to maintain his humanity within it. One choice, one life saved. His shoulders straightened. Perhaps that's the only legacy worth preserving, not the wealth or the power, but the capacity to choose decency when it matters most. The rain began to ease, sunlight breaking through clouds to create a prismatic dance across the valley. Harlow looked upward, blinking against the sudden brightness. Do you know what haunted me most all these years? He asked. Not that my grandfather might have been evil, but that evil might be my inheritance. That his blood in my veins meant his choices were inevitable in my future. He shook his head slowly. What a waste of a life, defending against a destiny that never existed. Marcus watched realization dawn across Harlow's features, the recognition that he had been fighting shadows, fortifying himself against a judgment that said more about his own fears than historical reality. He kept his secrets to protect me, Harlow continued, but his silence became my prison. I've done the same, building walls, maintaining distance, protecting everyone from a truth I couldn't face. His gaze hardened with resolve. No more secrets. No more running. The statement hung between them, a declaration that would reshape not just Harlow's understanding of his past, but the future he would now create. There will be consequences, Marcus said quietly. Your company, your reputation, let them come. Harlow's voice carried unexpected freedom. I've spent my life preparing for controversy, building shields against judgment. Perhaps it's time to build something else instead. He looked back toward the crossroads, the four paths extending outward. Something authentic. In that moment, Marcus witnessed the final transformation, from a man defined by what he feared to one defined by what he chose. The rain had stopped completely now, the world washed clean, waiting. Harlow took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Let's go back to Munich. I have calls to make, arrangements to set in motion. The familiar decisiveness had returned to his voice, but with a new quality, not the calculated control of a man with something to hide, but the clarity of one who had finally found solid ground. As they returned to the car, the crossroads remained behind them, four paths converging at a single point where a choice had been made. Not the choice to deny history or to be consumed by it, but to move forward carrying its full weight, its complete truth. The impossible burden had become, somehow, the foundation for something new. The private jet touched down in Los Angeles as sunset painted the sky in bands of amber and gold. Harlow stood at the cabin window, watching ground crew approach, ordinary people going about ordinary jobs, unaware that the man observing them had been fundamentally altered. "Home," Marcus said quietly, gathering their minimal luggage. Harlow smiled faintly. "Not the same home we left." The 48 hours in Germany had rewritten everything, not just Harlow's understanding of his grandfather, but his perception of himself. The man who had departed Los Angeles consumed by fear had returned unburdened, eyes clear with purpose. As the car approached the estate gates, Harlow broke the silence. "I want you in the meeting tomorrow, not as security, as witness." Marcus nodded, understanding the significance. For 3 years he had protected Harlow's perimeter, never allowed past the professional barriers. Now those barriers had dissolved, replaced by something unexpected, trust born from shared revelation. The meeting convened at 9 a.m. sharp in Harlow's private conference room. His executive team, 7 people who collectively managed his $18 billion empire, exchanged confused glances as Marcus took a seat beside their boss. Harlow had requested their presence with unprecedented urgency, offering no explanation. "I've made a decision," Harlow began without preamble. "I'm going public with my family history, the complete truth about my grandfather's role during the Holocaust and his subsequent actions." The reaction was immediate. His chief counsel paled. His PR director reached instinctively for her phone. His CFO dropped his pen. Richard, his longtime advisor Stephen, began carefully. "Have you considered the implications? The market reaction alone would—" "I've considered everything," Harlow interrupted calmly. "For 30 years. He outlined the plan with precision, a comprehensive statement, an in-depth interview with a respected journalist, the establishment of a foundation dedicated to Holocaust education and remembrance, funded with $300 million of his personal wealth, the publication of his grandfather's letters alongside historical context from leading scholars. The narrative will be controlled because it will be complete," he explained. "Not just his complicity, but his courage. Not just his silence, but his action. The full, complicated truth." His PR director recovered first. "The board will resist. Shareholders will panic. Our stock will plummet, at least temporarily." "Let it," Harlow replied, his voice steady. "We've built contingencies for every crisis except the one I've carried inside me. It's time to correct that oversight." The meeting continued for hours, strategies formulated, objections raised and addressed. Throughout, Marcus observed the transformation that had begun in Germany completing itself. The billionaire who had once micromanaged perception now embraced authenticity, regardless of consequence. When the executives finally departed, stunned but aligned with the new direction, Harlow turned to Marcus. "They think I've lost my mind." "Have you?" "Found it, more likely." Harlow moved to the window overlooking the city he had conquered. All these years building something that could withstand revelation, never realizing the revelation itself might be worth more than what I built to hide it. The announcement came 3 days later, measured, forthright, unapologetic. Harlow Industries stock dropped 17% by closing bell. News channels broadcast speculation about Nazi connections and hidden fortunes. Protesters gathered outside company headquarters, demanding resignations, investigations, accountability. Marcus witnessed all of it from Harlow's side. No longer just security, but confidant. He watched as the billionaire absorbed each blow without flinching, standing firmly in the uncomfortable space between condemnation and redemption. "You don't have to face them alone," Marcus said as they watched crowds gathering for a press conference. Harlow's expression remained calm. "I'm not alone anymore. That's the point." The press conference became the turning point. Standing before a wall of hostile journalists, Harlow spoke not as a businessman defending his reputation, but as a grandson honoring complicated truth. "My grandfather worked within a system of mechanized death," he stated, his voice unwavering. "That truth cannot and should not be erased. But when presented the opportunity to save one life, just one, he chose humanity over ideology, mercy over obedience. He paused, meeting the cameras directly. I stand before you today not to excuse his complicity, but to acknowledge the full measure of his humanity, both its profound failures and its singular courage. The room fell silent. The prepared questions about corporate responsibility and hidden assets suddenly seemed inadequate against this raw honesty. Then came the letters. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Messages from descendants of Holocaust survivors, from children of perpetrators, from families who had carried similar secrets for generations. They wrote of inherited shame, of questions never asked, of conversations that died when they entered the room. But mostly they wrote of recognition, of seeing themselves in Harlow's story, in his grandfather's complicated legacy, in the courage it took to step into historical accountability. One letter from a 93-year-old Holocaust survivor arrived personally addressed to Harlow. Truth honors the dead more than silence ever could. Thank you for completing the circle your grandfather began. Harlow read each message, responding personally to many. The protests gradually subsided. The stock price stabilized, then rose. The Foundation's first symposium sold out within hours. Marcus watched this transformation from protective distance, understanding that his role had evolved beyond security. He had become witness to something rare, a man choosing authenticity over safety, substance over appearance. The strangest part, Harlow confided one evening, is the freedom. All those years constructing defenses against a judgment that, when it finally came, mattered far less than I imagined. What legacy will you create with the truth of your own story? Share in the comments below what you hope people will remember about your life's journey long after you're gone. Sometimes our greatest impact comes not from what we achieve, but from the courage we show in facing who we truly are. 6 months after Harlow's public revelation, Marcus stood at the entrance of the newly established Reinhard Harlow Center for Historical Reconciliation. The modern glass building, erected on the edge of Harlow Industries campus, had become an unexpected pilgrimage site for families grappling with their own historical connections. Inside, visitors moved quietly through exhibits documenting both atrocity and resistance, the machinery of systematic murder alongside stories of small mercies that had created lifelines within darkness. At the center stood a simple glass case containing the original letter from Heinrich Harlow to his grandson, its weathered pages testimony to how truth can bridge decades. I never expected this, Harlow said, joining Marcus at the entrance. I thought I was simply clearing my conscience. What had begun as personal reckoning had expanded beyond anything either man could have anticipated. Historians who had studied the Holocaust for decades came forward with similar accounts. Small acts of resistance within complicity, moments of courage amid collaboration. Families who had changed names, burned documents, and built walls of silence began speaking their complicated truths. One elderly woman from Buenos Aires wrote that after reading Harlow's story, she had finally opened the locked cabinet containing her father's SS uniform and diary. 60 years of silence, she wrote, ended because you showed me that facing the whole truth, however painful, honors both victims and future generations more than protective lies. For Marcus, the transformation extended beyond witnessing public impact. His understanding of protection had fundamentally shifted. For years, he had defined his role through physical vigilance, monitoring perimeters, scanning crowds for threats, standing between his client and potential harm. Now he recognized a deeper truth. Sometimes the greatest protection came from standing beside someone as they faced their most difficult truths, not from shielding them from reality. You've changed how I see my work, he admitted to Harlow one evening as they reviewed security for an upcoming symposium. Before, I thought protection meant constructing barriers. Now I see it's sometimes about having courage to face what lies beyond them. Harlow nodded, understanding instantly. We build walls thinking they'll keep us safe, when often they're just prisons of our own making. The most profound impact emerged where least expected, in university classrooms where students now debated the complexities of moral choice during impossible times. In community centers, where descendants of survivors and perpetrators engaged in painful, necessary conversations. In corporate boardrooms, where executives began examining their own hidden histories. Wolfgang Reinhardt lived just long enough to see the center open. His foundation merged with Harlow's, Their combined resources funding research, education, and reconciliation projects worldwide. Before his death, he recorded 40 hours of testimony, not just about Heinrich Harlow's act of mercy, but about his own journey from Nazi youth to advocate for historical honesty. The boy he saved, Reinhardt said in his final interview, spent 70 years trying to be worthy of that moment. Perhaps that is all any of us can do with the life we are given, make it justify the mercy shown to us. For Harlow himself, the transformation was both professional and deeply personal. The empire he had built as fortress became instead a platform for confronting complicated truths. The distance he had maintained from colleagues, from relationships, from his own emotions, dissolved as he discovered connection through vulnerability rather than power. The strangest outcome, he confided to Marcus, is that by acknowledging my grandfather's worst truths alongside his best, I've finally become free to acknowledge my own. This perhaps was the most lasting impact, the recognition that healing begins not by burying the past, but by bringing it into light, examining it fully, and choosing to move forward carrying its complete weight. Not as burden, but as ballast. Marcus witnessed this daily in Harlow's interactions, the new ease in his movements, the absence of the vigilance that had once marked his every gesture. The man who had once calculated every word now spoke with authentic presence. The billionaire who had accumulated power as shield now wielded influence as bridge. One act of courage, a grandfather saving a single child amid systematic death, a grandson choosing truth over comfortable fiction, had indeed created ripples that continued expanding outward, touching lives across continents and generations, demonstrating how confronting our most difficult histories could become the foundation for our most meaningful futures. 1 year after the German phone call that changed everything, Marcus stood on the balcony of Harlow's office, watching the sunset paint Los Angeles in golden shadow. The security guard who had once maintained careful distance now occupied a unique position. Confidant, witness, friend to a man whose life had been transformed by confronting truth. History wants simple stories, Harlow said, joining him at the railing. Heroes who resist without compromise. Villains who embrace evil without question. But most lives exist in the space between, in small choices made under impossible pressure. Marcus nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for elaboration. What had begun as a standard security assignment had evolved into something profound, a front-row seat to one man's reconciliation with history. Before all this, Marcus admitted, I defined protection through distance. Keep threats away, monitor perimeters, maintain barriers. He turned to face Harlow directly. Now I understand that sometimes true security comes from facing what we fear most. This insight had reshaped his approach to everything. Not just his work for Harlow, but his relationships, his past military experiences, his understanding of courage itself. The man who had once specialized in constructing shields now recognized when they became constraints. Below them, visitors moved through the memorial garden where Heinrich Harlow's story stood alongside thousands of others. Testimonies to both human capacity for cruelty and momentary transcendence. The foundation now supported similar projects worldwide, creating spaces where uncomfortable truths could be examined without judgment or simplification. My grandfather taught me something he never intended, Harlow said quietly. That legacy isn't what we build to impress others or protect ourselves. It's the courage we find when faced with choices that reveal who we truly are. The observation stretched beyond one family's complicated history to touch something universal. How we all navigate the moral complexity of our lives, seeking redemption not through perfection, but through moments of authentic humanity. In the end, Harlow continued, we're remembered not for what we accumulated or achieved, but for when we chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, connection over isolation. As darkness settled over the city, both men contemplated this final truth. The transformation begins not by rewriting history, but by facing it completely, allowing its full weight to reshape who we become next. Some stories change more than our understanding. They change who we are. If you found yourself questioning your assumptions about good and evil, about the gray areas where most humans actually live, Subscribe now for more life-changing tales that illuminate the complexity of the human experience. Every week, we explore moments when a single choice revealed character, changed destiny, and left a legacy that continues transforming lives today.